Between 2000 and 2017, other countries' debt owed to China soared tenfold, from less than $500 billion to more than $5 trillion, or from 1% of global economic output to more than 5%. This is according to a study from a German-based think tank, the Kiel Institute for the World Economy. This has transformed China into the largest official creditor, easily surpassing the IMF or World Bank. For 50 of the developing countries which have borrowed from China, that debt has increased on average from less than 1% of their GDP in 2015 to more than 15% in 2017. In fact, estimates now suggest that China is now responsible for around a quarter of bank lending to emerging markets. Now, as we can see here, a huge portion of Africa and developing parts of South America have a high amount of debt to China. In fact, some countries have more than 25% of their GDP in terms of debt to China. Now, this is actually quite similar to the strategy used by the US on developing economies in the 1960s and 70s, and here is why. Well, debt is used as a tool to control nations, and obviously people.
This is because it provides leverage that can, and is, used.
But why Africa? What does China want? Now, the answer to that is actually very simple. It wants resources, commodities, energy. Now, the US would lend to developing economies via private lenders initially, and then use the IMF in order to negotiate a structural adjustment. What does structural adjustment mean? Well, it basically means that the developing country has to deregulate and open up resources and commodities to producers in order to let massive Western companies in and take advantage. And this is all stemming from that original leverage. So as an example, engineering companies will go to an emergent economy and say, look, we have this great project, we have this proposal for a project that could really stimulate your economy, lead to huge economic growth using complex technical models to support that narrative. And the leaders of many said countries would say, wow, that sounds great, we have economic growth, it's cool. It would then take out a private loan from lenders in the West, and the money would go to the contractor undertaking the project. So the money doesn't see the light of day in the developing country. So the project happens and the country doesn't quite see the economic growth it expected. Guess the models were quite wrong. And thus it can't pay down the debt. That's where the IMF steps in and effectively says, we'll let you refinance the loan at a lower interest rate if you undertake structural adjustments. Or we can cut you off from the global economy due to your low credit rating and inability to pay down debt. No foreign investment for you. What's even better is that the wealthier nations tend to guilt their normal citizens, or plebs, as some members of the British upper classes would say, into donating via charity to many of these poor countries. Or, in the Vatican's case, using donations intended for the poor to help plug its budget deficit, with only 10% of donations actually going to charitable works. What is slightly different about China's approach is that they are actually building infrastructure. But of course, building infrastructure to help out Africa is not the main incentive. Nothing is free, except smashing the like button, of course. There is, of course, the diplomatic benefit of using China's strengthening relationship with Africa to gain Africa's votes on sensitive matters in the
UN,
like the Taiwan and the South China Sea issues. Of course, there is the angle that suggests China is using state-funded energy infrastructure projects to open the door to Chinese corporate domination of African energy companies. However, that is a pretty standard practice and not unique to China. But nonetheless, the Chinese government could use its project financing to leverage lower prices for exports of African oil to China. There are also many developed countries in debt to China, and the advanced and higher middle income countries tend to receive portfolio debt flows via sovereign bond purchases of the People's Bank of China. Whereas the lower income developing economies mostly receive direct loans from China's state-owned banks, often at market rates and backed by collateral such as oil. And of course, in the current geopolitical struggle for power, it is now economic might that provides the leverage that really asserts dominance over other countries. So it is therefore important to think about how that will play out in the long term with regards to the US and China. Now, this therefore means that there are some important issues to iron out over the coming decades, And here are the thoughts of Steve Schwarzman, who is often described as the king of private equity and who has a current net worth of $18.8 billion.
The 16 different times is in the last 500 years where a challenger country was challenging an incumbent world power. And in 12 of those 16 times, there were wars between the challenger and the incumbent. That context, China in the last 40 years has grown faster than any other country, I believe, in world history. It's an astonishing thing that what's happened there, but they did it behind tariff walls, behind not traditionally open markets. They did it with certain types of, uses of intellectual property and other types of things that we don't do. Part of what they're doing just follows the normal trend of which the United States did in the 19th century. When we were little, we had big tariff barriers. People forget this. And then you get to be a grown-up, and then you drop that stuff away. So this is a dangerous situation, and I think one of the reasons why they've come back to the table is that this is not in the short-term, intermediate term, or long-term interest of their country. I don't think it's in our interest as well, and it's not in the interest of the world.
Now, we are already starting to see the Western media in the UK and US paint China as the bad guys. So it will be interesting to see how this plays out over the decades to come. And what are your thoughts? How do you think it's going to play out with a challenger to the #1 economic superpower over the last century? For more compounded valuable content, subscribe and like.